Tens of thousands of Egyptians took to the streets in Cairo and provinces throughout Egypt to oppose the military's July 3rd ouster of Mohamed Morsi, Egypt's first elected civilian president. The center point really for those protests was in Rab'a al-Adawiya square in eastern Cairo, where you had protesters that staged an open-ended sit-in that demanded that the military reinstate Morsi. On August 14th, the government forcefully dispersed the sit-in. Security forces opened fire directly on crowds of largely peaceful protesters. Human Rights Watch spent months going hospital to hospital, morgue by morgue, reviewing death lists, and we've documented at least 817 protesters that were killed that day.
أول حاجة شفتها كانت الساعة 6 الصبح. كان في رصاص فوق العمارة اللي احنا في الشارع بتاعها. شفت الرصاص كان بيخرم الحيطة وسمعته، فأيقنت إن دوت رصاص يعني صوت رصاص. ما كانش فيه تحذير.
Around 6 a.m., security forces arrived at 5 of the major entrances to Rab'a al-Adawiya square. Security forces began in some locations firing tear gas. However, they very quickly, in some places within minutes, escalated to live fire. They were also supported by snipers that fired atop nearby government buildings. And witnesses also told us that snipers fired from helicopters that were hovering around Rab'a al-Adawiya square.
What our investigation has found is that the method in which the government security forces carried out their dispersal, using live ammunition from the get-go, makes clear that this was a systematic, planned attack on protesters.
فاللي كان بيتراجع مثلا كنت بحاول ان انا اعالجه. كان معايا بيبسي الكولا، كنت بحطها مثلا على وش اي حد بيتحرق من الغاز وكده. تم استهدافي اكتر من مره بالخرطوش، جت في وشي لسعتني، بس انا تحملت. فبعدها على طول ضربني بالرصاص الحي. الرصاص الحي متفجر فعلا ودخل في دراعي وصدري. رصاصين في صدري وواحده في دراعي.
The government claims that armed protesters attacked them from the first minutes of the dispersal, and that all force it used was in reaction to that initial fire from protesters. However, at the end of the day, the Interior Ministry only found 15 guns in Rab'a Square, and 8 police officers were killed. This wasn't a case of security forces pinpointing particular armed elements within the demonstration and having collateral damage as a result. This was a plan that envisioned opening fire on crowds, tens of thousands of largely peaceful protesters for hours on end without safe exit for women, children, and those seeking to flee the violence.
كنت واقف، كان على يميني واحد وعلى شمالي واحد، الاتنين وقعوا وانا في النص. بقيت واقف مزبهل من الموقف. الناس حواليا كلها بتموت وانا واقف مش بيدي حاجة اعملها.
خلاص بدأ الرصاص بيجي، انت مش عارف الرصاص بيجي منين. بدأ ياخد رصاص، واضح ان هي رصاص كان هو كان واضح ان هو خلاص بدأ يعني خلاص كان شبه فقد روحه يعني شبه مات.
Security forces intensified their fire in the late afternoon as they made their final push into the heart of Rab'a Square. Some of the worst brutality took place during this period, with snipers and government forces opening fire throughout Rab'a Square.
سبت الدور الاول وكان في دم على الارض. السلالم كلها كانت، انا كنت حاسه ان انا بسبح في الدم، يعني كل حتى شكل الجزمه كان بيطبع وانا طالعه السلم دم. فضلت اطلع على السلالم واحد ورا تاني، والمشهد هو ذاته، والناس مصابين على الارض لحد ما طلعت اخر دور خالص، الدور السادس. قلت يمكن ده اللي يكون فيه العدد اهون شويه، وريحه الدم كانت صعبه. يعني انا وانا طالعه على السلالم حسيت ان انا طالعه في المسبح، اللي هو ريحه الدم كانت صعبه جدا، ودم بني ادمين.
Around 4:30 p.m., armored personnel carriers arrived at Rab'a Hospital, and they began firing directly into Rab'a Hospital. Human Rights Watch was in the building at the time and observed this as it happened. Security forces then entered the hospital and immediately ordered everybody out, telling them the hospital would be burned and to leave injured behind. Security forces had more or less secured Rab'a Square around 6 p.m. when they arrived by the stage at the very heart of where the demonstration had taken place. After 6 p.m., many protesters were finally able to leave after 12 hours of being trapped in Rab'a Square. Some of those that did not get out were beaten, tortured, and in some cases even summarily executed.
في حد كان مصاب. المصاب دوت كان مصاب برصاصة في بطنه، وكانت باينة جدا ان حاجات من بطنه باينة، يعني اظن امعاء او حاجة. جه العسكري وفضل واقف، يعني وقف على رجله وفضل يضربه يعني برجله وبالسلاح اللي معاه، بيضربه بالسلاح على وشه، بيضربه برجله في مكان اصابته، بحيث ان هو يعني يفضل ينزف لحد ما مات.
What we know, and what is actually a matter of public record, is that the highest levels of government officials in Egypt planned this dispersal. There was a very high-level meeting called of the most senior government officials, army officials, security officials, including the interior minister, including then defense minister, now President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, including all the top commanders, to plan this dispersal and anticipate that there would have a very high civilian death toll.
The dispersal at Rab'a was part of a broader pattern of security forces opening fire on crowds of demonstrators. It took place in several different instances that we observed in July and August of 2013. There was another smaller sit-in that had been taking place in al-Nahda Square in Greater Cairo, and security forces also dispersed that sit-in on August 14th, killing at least 87 demonstrators. The evidence we have indicates that the Rab'a massacre likely amounted to a crime against humanity. A crime against humanity is a systematic, widespread attack on a civilian population as part of a government policy. This is exactly what we saw in Rab'a Square. A crime against humanity is among the most serious violations of international law, one for which perpetrators can be held to account in courts anywhere in the world.
1 year later, despite the devastating massacre that took at least 817 lives, the Egyptian government has failed to investigate, much less prosecute and convict a single security officer or army officer for their role in the killings on that day. Yet they found fit to arrest, detain, and prosecute protesters, overwhelmingly peaceful protesters, who participated in the sit-in.
What's needed now is for states and the UN Human Rights Council to establish an international investigation into the Rab'a massacre and the other killings that took place in July-August 2013 for the purpose of identifying and holding to account the perpetrators of those killings.